Thin Wood Walls, Chapter 3. Street sounds woke me to early dawn darkness. In the bed next to mine, Mike slept restlessly, tossing and muttering. I crept to my window and saw headlights, the shapes of trucks and other vehicles streaming past our house like a long, dirty river. Convoys. Soldiers. Going where? After Seattle, where? How many would return? Wrapped in blankets, I opened the window wide and sat in its chill, listening to the noises, watching until the last truck roared by and vanished. There was no word of Dad. I went to school. In some ways, it was the same. Mrs. Linden said nothing about the bombing as we walked one by one into the familiar classroom that smelled of wet clothes and musty radiator heat and chalk dust. But I knew it was on her mind when she started the day with a prayer. A wish, she called it, for soldiers and sailors. May our young citizens here in this school and everywhere in the land be under your care, she said, and free of the fears and selfishness and prejudice that bring war, and that war brings. We started our lesson, reading to ourselves, and Mrs. Linden began a quiet journey around the room. She stopped at each of her young citizens, that's what she always called us, and talked softly and listened. I focused on my reader, trying not to overhear. Mrs. Linden didn't think of me as an eavesdropper. A row away and 3 desks toward the front of the room, Ray raised his arms in a big stretch. It was his signal that he was about to send me a message. I listened. In a moment, the light tap-tap-tap of a pencil began, and I concentrated on the Morse code letters. Then the words, all for one. All for one. I smiled to myself. It was the Three Musketeers motto, which Ray and I had adopted for ourselves. I raised my pencil and tapped back the answer. 1 for all. 1 for all. Ray turned and grinned, and the empty, aching feeling in my chest faded. When Mrs. Linden got to me, she crouched down and put her hand over mine and smiled, but her eyes looked sad. Are you worried, Joseph? She said. I nodded. I'm sure your father will be home soon, she said. I felt my face get hot, my eyes watery. I wondered how she knew until I saw Ray glance back at us. She had already talked to Ray. Your mother and grandmother will take very good care of you until he returns, she continued. And you have Mike. Her eyes smiled. Mike had been one of her students also, less interested in learning but more outgoing than I was. I had heard Mom talk of him being a charming thorn in the side of his teachers. Would Mrs. Linden smile at the memory of me in 5 years? They wouldn't even let him get dressed, I said. Raymond said it was scary. My father wasn't scared. Good, she said. But there's nothing wrong with being scared. I think everyone's at least a little scared. Even the government. Where do you think they took him? I don't know, she said, but I'm sure he's safe and warm and missing you. I nodded. I wanted to think so, too. She smiled and got up and continued around the room. Wherever a kid was sitting in a desk, she stopped and talked, taking her time. But not all the desks were occupied. More than half of my classmates were Japanese-American kids, and some of them were absent. I wondered if they were sick, or sick at heart. Had their dads been taken during the night? I thought of my friend, May Mizuno, whose dad was in the Japanese Association with my dad. Ray stuck close by me all day, and when he wasn't wearing his worried face, he tried to smile. But some of the looks I got from the other white kids were different. Cold glares, frowns, a quick glance, and a quicker glance away. One, Lee Bogan, gave me a long stare, as if he were seeing me for the first time. The way the class divided up at recess was different, brown and white instead of swirls of both. Only Ray and I stood together, pretending things were the same. Around us there was more whispering, looking up at the sky. When we came in from recess, a piece of lined paper lay on my desk. I turned it over. Someone had drawn a picture of a grinning, toothy, squinty-eyed guy leaning out of an open cockpit airplane. He held a bomb. Under the picture was my name. Under that, some fake Japanese writing. I sat, my face growing hot, and crumpled the paper into a ball. Someone laughed. I looked across the room at Veronica Oliver, the only person in my class talented enough to draw that picture. Her face was pink. Her eyes were turned away. She was fingering a shiny quarter. Somebody had put her up to it. I counted smiles. 5. 3 boys, 2 girls. The Richardson twins. All of them had been my friends, or at least friendly to me once. I stood, my heart was pounding, my hands clenched and unclenched. The smile on the face of the closest of the 3 boys, Kenneth Stanley, faded as I took a step toward him. I hoped it wouldn't disappear. I wanted to smack it away. "You think this is funny, Kenny?" I said. I tried to keep my voice low, but it rose and trembled in my throat. "I didn't," he began. "What is it, Joseph?" Mrs. Linden said. I stopped. Nothing. She studied me through the tops of her glasses. "If you say so." She watched me return to my desk, then started writing our lesson on the blackboard. Her words blurred. I hunched over. So much had changed. But I hadn't. I was still a U.S. citizen. I had lived here my whole life. My parents had come here before the parents of some of my white classmates. Japan was the enemy. I wasn't. I uncrumpled the wad of paper and smoothed it out on my desk. I blinked my eyes until they cleared, until I saw what was written under my name was English, just made to look like Japanese characters. "The sneaky country where your parents were born attacked us," the words said. "Thousands of men are dead. Thousands more will die. Are you happy?" Wiping at my eyes, I gazed around the room. No one looked back. I pictured myself in a mirror. To some, I had the face of the enemy. But not to Ray. He walked me home. We talked about basketball. I didn't tell him about the drawing, the words. Our car was still parked in the driveway, but in a different place. Dad had come home. I was almost sure. I burst through the door. Mom stood inside, hanging up her coat. Grandmother sat at the living room window. "We haven't heard anything, Joseph." Mom's voice was calm, but I could see worry in her eyes. "Nothing," I said. She shook her head. Mike barged in, his shirt torn and muddy, his face dark with anger. I hurried to close the door, half afraid someone was on his tail. But he was alone, not talking. We followed him to the kitchen. He dropped his books on the table and went to the sink. He let the water flow over his knuckles. Mom went to him with a towel and soap. I saw blood. "What happened, Michael?" She worked soap into his hands and rinsed them until he danced with pain. He didn't answer. He took the towel and dried himself. Pink flowers bloomed on the white cloth. Grandmother bustled around, bringing me milk and chocolate cake, making me sit. "What happened?" Mom repeated. Mike was mad, but he knew better than to ignore Mom. "Michael Hanada, the Jap, taught Earl Mueller some manners," Mike said. "Sit," Mom said, and pointed to a chair. Mike sat next to me, eyeing my milk and cake. Grandmother brought him none. Mom brought him none. "What did you do?" she said. "I planted his big farmer face in the mud." I heard pride in Mike's voice. I cringed. I had a feeling Mom wasn't in the mood for pride. She sat across from him, eyes smoky. "He called you Jap?" Yes, the pride was gone. And he pushed me. He kept pushing. The kids were there, outside the school, white faces everywhere. "Will he be the last to call you Jap?" His parents are German immigrants. If they hadn't come here, he'd be marching with Hitler's youth. "Will he be the last?" Mike shook his head. "No." It wasn't the answer I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear that it wouldn't happen again, ever. I wanted things back the way they were. I wanted Dad home. Suddenly I felt like a character inside one of the stories I had written. Good guys, bad stuff happening. I didn't like the feeling. "Will you fight all of them?" Mike took his time. His eyes sparkled at the idea, fighting all of them. But finally he shook his head. Mom gazed at him until he looked away, out at the darkening sky. "In our old country there is a saying, Michael. I think the leaders there have forgotten it, but they would have done well to remember." Mike looked back at her as she put one small hand over his raw knuckles. "To lose is to win," she said. "Remember that, Michael." She put one soft hand on mine and stared at me until my face grew warm. "Joseph?" She got up and poured Mike a glass of milk. She cut him a piece of cake. Gigantic. I didn't complain. She turned on the radio. Music played. Someone knocked at the door. When I opened it, 3 families stood around our steps. Mr. and Mrs. Hoshida, Mr. and Mrs. Nagasawa, Mr. and Mrs. Yano. They're children, 10 altogether. Come in, I said, not sure where they would fit. Mr. Nagasawa shook his head. Is your mother home, Joseph? Mom, I called. She hurried in from the living room. Mike and grandmother came and stood next to me. Come in from the cold, Mom said. Mr. Hoshida tipped his hat. We can't stay, Michi, he said. He glanced over his shoulder toward the street. Tomio is not home yet? Mom shook her head. We share your loss, he said. We pray for his quick return. In the meantime, we, all the community, will do whatever we can to help. Thank you, Mom said, but I knew her. She wouldn't ask for help. Still, it made me feel good to know there were people on our side. Please call on us, Michi, Mrs. Hoshida said. She smiled at us. Your sons and mother-in-law also. Grandmother held my elbow in her thin fingers. I felt them squeeze. We will, Mom said. You are kind. He has done much for us, Mr. Nagasawa said. He and his family stepped back. We will leave you to your evening. They turned and started for the street. The Hoshida and Yano families nodded goodbye to us and followed them. They got quietly into their cars and drove away. I wondered if we would see them again. I had just gone back to the kitchen when there was another knock. This time Mike opened the door. I arrived at the entryway in time to see Mr. Spooner walk in, dressed for church or visiting. He was wearing a tie, he had his hat in his hands, his graying hair was slicked back from his thin face. I was used to him in overalls and a cowboy hat, working his farm or in town getting supplies. Dad leased our 20 acres of farmland from Mr. Spooner. He nodded to Mom, Mrs. Hanada, and to Grandmother, Mrs. Hanada. He shook hands with Mike, then me. His hand was rough from field work. Boys? Mr. Spooner, Mom said. She closed the door behind him and the house went quiet. I heard the news, he said, about Tomio. Yes, Mom said. Would you like to come in? She gestured towards the living room. Have some tea with us? I have to get back, Mr. Spooner said, but I left a box next to your steps, from our cellar, root crops and things Mrs. Spooner canned. Thank you, Mom said. Her eyes looked wet, but it wasn't necessary. It's not much, Mr. Spooner continued, as if he'd memorized what he was going to say, but you might have a need, and if there's anything more we can do, please come over or send the boys or call. He handed Mom a slip of paper with a phone number on it. She took it, but her eyes were down, and she was swallowing hard. Thank you, Grandmother said. Mr. Spooner nodded to her. Then Mom. Boys, he said to us. He forced a smile and turned toward the door. We picked out a Christmas tree, I blurted out before he could leave. From your land, a perfect one. Mr. Spooner turned back. He smiled. This time it wasn't forced. It really is a perfect one, Mike said. Joe found it on his own. No one asked for my opinion, Grandmother said. Mr. Spooner blinked at her, as if he didn't know what to say to that complaint. I hope you found the best one on the place, he said to us. We have it tagged, I said, hoping to keep anyone else from cutting it, for after my dad gets home. I'm sure that will be soon, Joe, Mr. Spooner said. With a white handkerchief, I said. Mr. Spooner chuckled. That'll work, he said. Mike opened the door for him, and he walked out and down the steps. A veteran of the last big war, he usually walked like a soldier, but tonight his shoulders looked weighed down, his back bent. It took both Mike and me to carry the box in and set on the kitchen table, where Mom was lighting candles. Because of the fear of an air raid, the government had imposed a blackout. Electric lights were forbidden unless you had dark shades or black painted windows or black paper covering them. We didn't have those things yet. It was scary walking around the darkening house, thinking about what might be coming through the sky. I reminded myself of what Ray's dad had said. If the bombers were coming, they would have already come. If they did come now, they couldn't see our candles from high in the clouds. Even the government said so. I carried a thick stub of a candle to my room and watched as more convoys rolled past. I worked on my journal, finding myself writing more than I wanted, writing until the words captured what I had seen and felt. Mom called me downstairs into the living room where she and Mike and Grandmother sat by the radio. Their faces looked spooky in the candlelight. An announcer was introducing a recording of speech President Roosevelt had given that morning. Sit down, Joseph, Mom said, patting the Davenport cushion between her and Grandmother. I sat. It felt good to be included, even though I had already heard about the speech. The president's voice came on, sounding small. But his words were big. He spoke of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, blasting away my visions of crystal water and pearls that shone like the moon. He said many lives had been lost, that military forces were severely damaged. He said the distance between Japan and Hawaii meant the attack had been planned for weeks, even as the Japanese ambassador was in Washington talking peace. The president reported the torpedoing of American ships on the high seas and attacks on the Malaya, Hong Kong, Guam, and the Philippine Islands. Wake Island, Midway Island. Familiar names. Unfamiliar names? My stomach twisted at the mention of each one. The president asked Congress to declare that since the attack, unprovoked and dastardly, he called it, war has existed between the U.S. and Japan. And he said something else, something that pricked every inch of my skin. Hostilities exist, he said. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. The words scared me. They made me think of invading armies, enemy ships off our shores, dive-bombing planes. But another thing bothered me more. I wondered if he meant me, my family, our community, when he said our.